So I started hearing from students over time that they were getting so depressed about what they were studying that they were actually considering dropping out of the major. And at the same time, I had another group of students who were actually had lived experiences of climate disruption. I've had a couple of students who were in Houston during Hurricane Harvey, whose families lost houses, who had to evacuate. Had other students who their families come from Eastern Washington. They work outside in agriculture under extremely brutal heat and the smoke pollution we've had in summers in last year, in previous years. So that's kind of how I came to teach this class. So what I want to do is talk a little bit about my experience teaching this undergraduate seminar, again, on climate anxiety and eco-grief. And the class itself is meant to help students develop the emotional skills and the resilience to stay engaged in climate solutions without becoming overwhelmed or burning out or dropping out of the major. Just a year ago, when I would give a talk like this, I would have to introduce these terms and explain climate depression and eco-grief and pre-traumatic stress. Unfortunately, they've become so common that just over the past year, I'm sure probably everybody has heard them now and understands that climate disruption is not just about physical impacts. It is also something that is taking a very heavy psychological toll. The most visible or dramatic psychological impacts are trauma and other mental health consequences from direct experience of an extreme weather event. And there's a growing body of research, including a major study from the American Psychological Association that links climate disruption with chronic anxiety, depression, post-traumatic stress, substance abuse, suicide or suicidal thoughts, sleep disorders. It goes on and on. And Hurricane Katrina is one of the most extensively studied disasters to date. The APA reports show that in the aftermath, 1 in 6 people impacted met the diagnosis for PTSD, and suicide or suicidal thoughts more than doubled for displaced people in New Orleans. And then you can go to the opposite side of the world, where Australian farmers, their crops and livelihoods have been ruined by the decade-long millennial drought. And that's been linked to substance abuse, chronic depression, domestic violence. Or you can go to the Arctic, where indigenous people are losing the ability to continue traditional hunting and cultural practices because the landscape is melting beneath them. Suicide has spiked. People say their entire cultural identity is being wiped out. And I think that quote from an Inuit woman is really powerful in speaking to that. These lists just go on and on. And then, of course, poor and vulnerable communities and communities of color are experiencing the heaviest emotional toll, since they are disproportionately impacted by environmental decline and often already suffer from limited access to affordable housing or shelter, basic resources like healthcare, emergency services, safe drinking water. So all of that makes it much more difficult to recover from these upheavals. But I also want to emphasize that this phenomenon is not just about these really extreme events and full-blown climate disasters that you see on the news. Our daily lives are changing in 1,000 subtle ways, whether it's dying trees along your commute or disappearing songbirds and bees in the backyard, fewer fish in the river, a lot more wildfire smoke. All of those can add up to a very deep sense of loss and loss of place. And so I think environmental philosopher Glenn Albrecht uses this term Solastalgia. It's similar to nostalgia, which is a longing for a time or a place that you can't go back to, except with Solastalgia, you've never left home. It's more like home has left you. So it's defined as a homesickness experienced without ever leaving home. So that's just a quick overview of what we're talking about when we use terms like eco-grief. Usually when I give talks, I share a few key strategies that my students have found helpful for managing eco-anxiety and depression, and I will share some of those. They really do apply more to folks in that second category of solastalgia and not the traumatic displacements and climate disasters. But I'm only going to spend a few minutes here because I think there's a deeper issue that I want to get to. And I actually think that these steps are pretty self-evident. It doesn't take any special expertise to figure this out. Number one is to acknowledge and talk about it. Talk itself is therapeutic. And if you're like me and you've spent entire nights lying awake in bed, consumed with a sense of panic for the troubles of the world, just hearing yourself say out loud, what it is that's keeping you up can make those troubles seem more manageable. And many of you probably know this saying from neuroscience: if you can name it, you can tame it. But that's especially important in a culture that constantly tells us that we should avoid negative thoughts. And I've heard a lot of my professors, my colleagues at the University of Washington, as well as climate activists, say that they feel this tremendous pressure to always project hope and optimism. And we all understand that hope-based messaging and communication is very important strategically, but I think the climate community can also go too far in policing any expression of those darker emotions. And that can really backfire when we consider that suppressing feelings of sadness or anger leads to much bigger problems down the road. Chronic depression, substance abuse, rage. There's extensive research to show that. And then a secondary benefit that is directly related is that openly talking about emotional responses to environmental loss helps create a sense of community and solidarity. And that is, I think, really crucial, because much of the depression in response to this crisis arises from this sense that we feel alone or isolated. I hear this over and over again from my students. They're taking the class because they feel so isolated. Maybe their family is dismissive of climate issues. So being heard by a supportive group when you feel distress and frustration can be a really powerful remedy. And then second, in my classes, I have students channel their grief creatively, and just the creative writing or the free writing activity that you did when we opened up, that can be one way of doing so. But I really want to emphasize ritual here, because ritual is a universal way that we navigate the mourning process, since it gives us some control and structure. And it can often also bring an element of beauty to painful experiences. And also, since ritual is already familiar to most of us as a response to personal bereavement, those practices can be translated to losses in the natural world. So my students have created memorial services to coral reefs, and sometimes this involves humor as well. I mean, our responses don't always have to be somber, but they have written eulogies. They've actually taken a lot of inspiration just over the last year from the performative elements of Extinction Rebellion, which is pictured here. And then also global events like the Remembrance Day for Lost Species. This happens every year on November 30th. Anybody can host an event anywhere in the world. This here is a photo of mourners carrying the world's last passenger pigeon to be burned on a funeral pyre. This is an image of a processional for the Great Auk, which was driven to extinction in 1844. And then more recently, some of you probably heard of this from the past summer, Icelanders held a memorial service and installed a plaque commemorating the first glacier that was lost to climate change. Here's a piece that incorporates ecological performance as the tide rises and wipes out those birds on the sand. Practices like this they're cathartic. They allow intense feelings a safe release through ritual. And then as a secondary benefit, grieving in a collective fashion removes isolation from other mourners, which can help shake us from collective denial. And of course, there's also a political aspect to ritual, since if you think about collective expressions like vigils and protests and memorials, the impetus here is to bring visibility to losses or injustices that might otherwise go unacknowledged. And one final example is from right here locally in Seattle. This is a Seattle-based artist, Chris Jordan, who made a documentary called Albatross about the death of seabirds from ingesting plastic trash and the depression that he fell into from witnessing and documenting this. And so he had to develop his own ritual for coping by using that ingested plastic to create these mandalas So he's essentially transforming the same material that killed those birds into a memorial. And I would say that early on in my seminar, students kind of wince at this assignment. The idea of a funeral for a bird or a glacier just seems very foolish. But over the course of the seminar, they often see that that response in itself is the symptom of a culture that doesn't offer us very meaningful ways to acknowledge grief for non-human lives or for lost places. And that our culture is essentially grief. This is a quote from Jeremy Hance. He called it grief-phobic or death-phobic and grief-illiterate. And that's from an essay that he wrote titled, "Why Don't We Grieve for Extinct Species?" And then number 3, take action. Civic action is therapeutic, whether it's taking part in a climate strike, and my students they've talked about how empowering it felt to finally feel seen and heard in a group, or it could be service work in our community. Just to be clear, the point here is not that a team of weekend volunteers is going to solve climate change with their restoration project, but once again, it helps build solidarity. And it exercises our civic muscles, which is really imperative at a moment when we desperately need collective action. And yet we're still fixated on these individual consumer responsibilities and market-based solutions. So buying eco-friendly products or eating less meat or using our reusable shopping bags, right? Those are all great. I do them too, but I don't pretend that that's actually going to solve this problem. They pale in comparison to what we can achieve through coordinated political action. Okay, so a lot of what I just said is probably familiar, or at least intuitive to many of you. There's really nothing groundbreaking. What's more important, I think, is the opportunity in this moment to resist conventional assumptions about grief as something to be resolved, and to consider the benefits and the wisdom that can arise from grief, especially as it relates to ecological loss. So how might grief be a resource for examining and addressing root causes of social and ecological suffering? How might grief serve as an ally and a guide in promoting interspecies empathy and climate justice by promoting an awareness of our shared vulnerability, what Judith Butler calls, quote, a point of identification with suffering itself? And you might consider some of these as you are writing and talking in groups today. I'm going to offer just a few ideas that we can build on, or maybe even push back against. But first, it's really important, I think, that we do not pathologize responses like grief and anxiety in response to ecological loss, or feed into narratives that young people have a condition, or that they have some sort of mental illness because they're experiencing distress, right? Grief is not a dysfunction. It is a normal and healthy response to loss. So this is something vital to remember, right? Grief arises from deep attachment and connection. It is a sign of love for our world. And grief can also be a powerful affirmation of trans-species empathy and a recognition that our identities and our well-being are fundamentally entwined with other lives, human and non-human. And Chris Jordan, once again, he's written about that when we try to always be cheerful and suppress our grief for the world, we're also suppressing our love for it. And so he writes, grief and love can be seen as inseparable twins. When we hold grief at a distance, our love becomes inaccessible. And when we embrace grief, we reconnect with the essential aspect of our being that has gone missing. So acknowledging this doesn't cancel out the pain, but it does help us shift from a mindset of feeling broken and dysfunctional to feeling connected and operating from a place of justice and compassion. Second, we can recognize that grief can be a political act. We tend to think of grief as privatizing, as a condition where we turn inward and we turn away from the world. But reframing the questions that we ask about grief can surface its radical potential. So what happens when we go beyond asking, what does it mean to mourn, and ask instead, what does it mean to mourn the loss of non-human bodies? Or how might grief for animals, forests, oceans, or rivers disrupt modes of thought that regard human lives as the only mournable subjects? Those questions shift the trajectory of the entire conversation, because expressions of grief for lost species or places challenge artificial divisions between lives and bodies that are and are not to be mourned. And in fact, when we refuse to shield ourselves from the pain of other species' death, we take place in what scholars call resistant mourning, which consciously chooses to hold on to feelings of pain and grief to spur a sense of responsibility for loss. And the work of theorist Judith Butler is enlightening here, and that's her quote reflecting on what counts as a livable life and a grievable death. And then once we start asking those questions, they ramify out into all other forms of structural exclusions from our circles of compassion and ethical consideration. People of color, women, indigenous groups. So the politics of grief intersects with questions of social justice on multiple levels. And that brings me to number 3. Indigenous scholars argue that grief can be a valuable lens for deepening and expanding discussions around environmental racism and climate colonialism. So Ron Reed, who is a traditional Karuk fisherman and also the cultural biologist for the Karuk tribe in California, he and Kari Norgard published a really fascinating study on the emotional impacts of declining salmon in the Klamath River, which resulted in a disruption of native identity and ways of life based on fishing. And they start with this recognition that for indigenous people in North America, quote, land, plants, and animals are considered sacred relatives, and thus their loss becomes a source of grief. So what might happen, or what might come from recognizing and centering those emotions as part of the ongoing experience of colonialism, and framing collective grief as its own index of environmental injustice. Reed writes that, quote, because the dominant non-native society does not recognize the deep emotions we describe between humans and the natural world, Karuk grief and other emotions related to their loss is invisible. And that invisibility compounds, and that lack of legitimacy intensifies the harm that is done to indigenous people. So this is what's referred to as disenfranchised grief. It's a loss that's experienced but can't be openly acknowledged or publicly mourned. Okay, so those are the kind of three points we might think about. Grief as a function of love and attachment, grief as a political act that challenges artificial divisions, and then grief or its invisibility as a way to surface and understand structural injustice. And there, of course, are many, many more, and I'm sure many of those will be surfacing as we're all talking today. To close, I want to leave you with a quote from Joanna Macy, who's been saying all of this, I think, for a very long time. She writes, "It is good to realize that falling apart is not such a bad thing. Indeed, it is as essential to transformation as the cracking of outgrown shells. Anxieties and doubts can be healthy and creative, not only for the person, but for the society, because they permit new and original approaches to reality. What disintegrates in periods of rapid transformation is not the self, but its defenses and assumptions. Self-protection restricts vision and movement like a suit of armor, making it harder to adapt. Going to pieces, however uncomfortable, can open us up to new perceptions, new data, and new responses." And then just to close, I want to put up a slide that has 5 different books that I think each one of them, as I started looking through some of these resources, and we will be making another list available to you via email after this talk. But each one of these seem to engage a different affect or a different emotion, right? And the one on the very end in the top left-hand corner, I'm very excited about. It hasn't come out yet, but going to be released this April by Sarah Jaquette Ray. So she's really looking at the response of fear, but we also here have shame, grief, sadness, and hope. And Joanna Macy was the one that I just quoted from at the very end as well. So that's it for my little mini presentation, and hand it back over to Clayton.